I think you learn good and bad as far as what this team needs going forward. Like, it's unfortunate that Kyler Murray was unable to kind of come up with those big plays in the fourth quarter that could push the team, which was determination of a win and a loss. But I think it showed that you need to continue to build this team. How do we quantify the Arizona Cardinals 2024 season? Of course, didn't make the postseason, but was it a success? Bo Brack hanging out with you from PHNX Cardinals, along with my former co-host, an old friend of mine. I reluctantly bring him on here. It's Alex Clancy, Locked On Cardinals. And Alex, when we start to look back now with a couple weeks in between the Cardinals season finale, the win against the San Francisco 49ers, how are you feeling as far as like post-mortem the 2024 season?
Carolina, I still can't shake. I think that's the big one where it's like, going into week 11, it was a win. Afterwards, they played terribly. Like we all remember what happened. The Carolina one was the one that I couldn't really understand because that would have kept their playoff hopes alive. Seattle fell off a cliff. It was setting the stage for that week 17 game against the Rams where they could have got a dub. It would have been completely different. And you're playing against a depleted 49ers team in week 18. It's like, it was there.
Yeah.
Their last chance was there, and they weren't able to take advantage. So that's what stings really at this point, a couple weeks out.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, it kind of encapsulates like the failures of this team, right? Like it was close. Obviously, they did what they needed to do to get to overtime in that game. But when James Conner, who was dominating in that game, like he was the offense the entire first half, I think he had over 150 yards from scrimmage. When he goes out in the third quarter and you have to dial up the pass game, you were incapable of doing it. Like, and that was what cost the Arizona Cardinals. And, they fall to Bryce Young, and for Bryce Young to come up with the big plays when unfortunately Kyler Murray in that contest couldn't come up with. And then, you miss out on that chance to go in prime time against the LA Rams a few days later. It really is unfortunate. With all that being said, there are positives, right? And I think that the conversation, when it's going to be had now, when it's going to be had a couple months down the road, and maybe even next season, when we look back at it, you can't just to have conversations about this season. You can't do it without nuance. It's not like a black and white. They didn't make the postseason, thus it's a failure, right? Like, I think them firmly putting themselves in the conversation in all but two games, the final two games of December, early January, didn't have any meaning to them. They were playing meaningful December football games. And when you look back at it, what do you think was the biggest positive for the Cardinals season?
The secondary. When you look at those young DBs with Budda Baker and Jalen Thompson, Dajon Taylor-Demerson over the top, they're like the Rams front. They're young and they're going to be here forever, and it's going to be super cheap. That's the biggest win for me. Naturally, Trey McBride, James Conner, you knew that. The offensive line, for the first 10, 11, 12 weeks were great. Kyler Murray showed flash, Drew Cutching, but that secondary was most directly correlated. I said before the season started, that's me the most direct correlation to wins and losses. And they held their own without any sort of semblance of a pass rush. So if there's a positive, that's the biggest one. You add a couple veteran pass rushers, you draft whatever it may be, whatever Monty's going to do. That defense is going to be legit, immediately next year, and super cheap, aside from Budda Baker.
And it's going to get to my point where, I think that you continue to learn about what works, what doesn't, what you need to improve. Like the secondary, obviously, anything you add to the secondary this offseason, which it'd be tough to find a spot, because it's so jam-packed with ascending players from, obviously your second round pick in Max Melton to Garrett Williams, who was unbelievable this season, to the veterans and Budda Baker and Starling Thomas's emergence. Just whatever his role is, whether you feel comfortable with him starting or him being a depth piece is really good. And then we'll see what happens. Sean Murphy Bunting will be with this team going forward. It doesn't make sense, as far as what dead money's attached to his contract to move forward. But you beef up that defensive front seven. Yeah, this defense is going to be a problem, especially with what Nick Rallis showed as far as his ability to scheme. The one thing I'll say is I think you learn good and bad as far as what this team needs going forward. It's unfortunate that Kyler Murray was unable to kind of come up with those big plays in the fourth quarter that could push the team, which was determination of a win and a loss. but I think it showed that you need to continue to build this team. Like you still can add to the offense. You still can, as far as the offensive line, you can add to the playmakers. And of course, a defense that might be able to create more opportunities for this offense. I think the good and the bad that you learned about this team provided clarity from a team building standpoint where you need to go. But like before, it was like tear down the team to the studs and then build from there and then take inventory of it. But now I think you have a pretty good idea of where you need to go this offseason.
Yeah, and after the 2022 season, there was 45% retention rate. You had a good tweet yesterday about, or a couple days ago, about the actual list of players who were still here since 2022. It's a completely different roster. Yeah. So people who wanted it to be last year, people who didn't want to wait another year. It's year 6 for Kyler Murray. Why do you have to wait any longer? The plan was always 2025. They just happened to be ahead of the curve in 2024 with a chance to make the playoffs. They didn't. Shortcoming, sure. But you're right. There is a roadmap here. Now, the offensive line, it's both the lines in the first couple rounds and free agency. The offensive line can never get strong enough. Right. See what happens with the guards. See what happens with Will Hernandez. We'll see with Evan Brown, Yalta Frolds there. You probably want to draft a guy who can play center, so you're not in a Rodney Hudson, Max Garcia situation. You've got the tackles. We'll see what they do with Kelvin Beach. I'm probably going to move off from him. But yeah, like the biggest thing for me with the good and the bad is there needs to be the next iteration of Drew Petzing's offense where it's not just run the ball and Trey McBride and Marvin Harrison Jr. is there, but kind of an afterthought. I think they've got plenty of pieces on offense to eat now. And it's going to come down to Kyler Murray. Give it 60-40 Kyler Murray blame to Drew Petzing. Kyler Murray used to live in the gray. He used to be great in the gray when things weren't going perfectly. Now things need to be perfect in an effort for him to produce more times than not. And that's, troubling as we throw up year 7. It's like there's still a question about a quarterback. But, Bo, listen really quick. Do you look around the NFL and see all the bad quarterback play and then look at Kyler Murray and be like, it could be a lot worse?
Yes.
But the problem is it's hard to sell that to a fan base who's seen this countless times over and over again, aside from Carson Palmer making the NFC Championship game, 10 years ago at this point.
Yeah, I think that when you need a ton of context to kind of understand why in year 6 that you move forward with him at quarterback, like because of how dysfunctional the organization that Kyler Murray came into. Like you and I started to work together in 2018 and was one of the worst rosters in that decade of the NFL. And they're coming off Steve Wilkes and like historically bad offense. And then Kyler Murray just being on that team elevate that offense into at least modern day football as far as scoring points and being able to make plays on that side of the football. And then Kyler Murray created the crutch for the organization. And then they didn't properly build around him. And then he suffers the injury. He gets this infrastructure. And I think Kyler Murray between now and then, put himself, I think, in the conversation to be anywhere from 14 to cracking inside the top 10. But what we've learned about modern day NFL is you can have pretty statistics. You can win football games. But when it comes to playing at this time of year, they can expose you as a quarterback. And it sometimes being a fringe top 10 quarterback, normally you would sign up for that. It can be an indictment on that signal caller. You still need to do a lot of roster work in order for that to work. Because now you can have a good quarterback if your team sucks. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. And you can mask it. Jalen Hurts is an interesting case study where it's that is a perfect roster.
Yep.
And they still can't win aside from the regular season. So you can say what you want about that, but it's
39 yards through 3 quarters last week.
I mean, and Kyler Murray, he had 3 come from behind wins last year.
Yeah.
Okay? So it's not just the Raiders in 2022 when they had no business winning that game with the scoop and score in overtime. It's not just his first ever damn game as an NFL quarterback against the Lions at home when he brought that team back from 2 scores when Cliff said he thought he was going to get fired at halftime. Kyler Murray has special in him that less than half of the NFL has. Young, old, doesn't matter. And it's coaching and it's maturity from Kyler that we've seen a lot this year. It's not perfect. But as a man, as a person, as a leader, he is eons from where he was in 2021 in the last playoff game that people never want us to forget.
Right.
Next year, though, and you and I have talked about this on air, or on camera and off camera, it's this year or it's over.
Right.
But it's not like you win a Super Bowl or it's over. It's there has to be a lot more positive than negative this year, or we're going to be having very difficult conversations after the season.
Yeah, and I think like the margin, like what separates that is so minuscule. Like, and we saw it on full display. Like we saw during the 4-game win streak. You know, when you do things right, it translates to wins, and if you're just off just the slightest bit, it translates to losses in this league. So yeah, it is. So I think that like when you look at it, like the differences between the guys who were criticized heavily in the league and the guys who were celebrated, it is minuscule, but they're knocking on the door regardless. And that's who you need in this league. And especially when you look at the draft options, the free agent options, it doesn't make sense for a pivot point, but I completely agree with you. And I think that factors into like what you learn. Like what you learned is you got a prove it season coming up for your franchise quarterback. But last thing, like in getting back and kind of putting a bow on this thing, as you quantify this season, like how do you look back at it overall?
One of my favorite things to say about this organization is as long as it's not a step back, it's a step forward. As long as it wasn't a step back. There were some very redeemed. Trey McBride, tight end 1. Garrett Williams, CB 1. Buda Baker, here until he retires. James Conner, here you think until he retires. Yalta Ferholt is legit. Paris Johnson's legit. Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to be fine. Like, I'd give it a B+, especially for the expectations going into the season in a vacuum. Maybe a B. But yeah, there's so many future pacing, redeeming qualities for this organization, and there are still massive holes on this roster. So, I mean, I think it's a win. It sucks, but it's a win.
What do you think about the Cardinals season in 2024? Obviously, drop a comment, leave a like on this video, subscribe to PHNX Sports, and check out what Clancy's doing over on Locked On Cardinals. You can find on YouTube and, of course, wherever you find your podcasts. Clancy, it's fine. You know, it's always
one of the fun ones, actually. You let me talk more.